When I was young, I was a voracious reader. In fact, my reading became something of a problem when I began filling up my parents' bookshelves and we began running out of space, and eventually they handed me one of those e-readers. I think it was a Nook at the time, and said, "No more paper books for you. We simply don't have the space." And of course, like most kids, I wasn't reading philosophical treatises or theological tomes. I was reading stories. Stories that took me to other worlds and took me on incredible adventures. And I hope that you've experienced something like this too, whether it was to the wizarding world of Harry Potter or journeys to Mordor in Lord of the Rings or any number of wonderful stories. Hopefully you've had that experience of going on an incredible adventure without ever having to actually move your feet. But then something happened later in my life, and perhaps something that's happened to you as well. After briefly leaving the faith, or maybe more accurately becoming disillusioned with my faith, difficult to say, but I came back to the faith with such hunger and zeal that for a time I didn't read any fiction. I became solely focused on reading nonfiction. In fact, I was the guy who, for like my light reading at the beach, I was bringing like N.T. Wright tomes and A.W. Tozer and Watchman Nee. I was the life of the party. I've been told this many, many times. And I think this happens to many of us. I think that sometimes we get so focused on the goodness of faith, on the importance of theology, that we set aside fiction. We think it's something childish. We think it's something frivolous, something that perhaps we don't need anymore. But I think that that is mistaken. So today I would like to talk a little bit about why fiction is so important for us, not just as people, but as Christians specifically. And along the way, I might recommend a book or two. So if your reading list wasn't long enough already, well, maybe I can add some to yours today. The first point I'd like to make is that reading fiction is a decentering act, which can help us become more just people. Okay, big claim. Where did that come from? That seems out of left field. Well, maybe you've heard me talk about this book before. Ironically, it's nonfiction, but it's wonderful. And it's a book by Elaine Scarry called On Beauty and Being Just. And in her book, she makes the claim that beauty, art, aesthetics, right, they can actually make us more just people, which seems outrageous. But the argument's actually pretty simple. The idea is that so much of our lives we spend kind of turned in on ourselves. Luther would talk about this, like Kravatason said, we are people that are so focused on ourselves, we don't look outward. And of course, looking outward is where the great virtues come from. And what Elaine Scarry argues in her book is that fiction, or not fiction, for her it's just art generally, but fiction is certainly an art, I think we can agree with that, that art turns us out to look at something else. And as we gaze upon something else and note it specifically as beautiful, something worthy, something that should have our attention, something good, it moves us to the periphery. We live so much of our life at the center, thinking we're the center of all existence, but art, it moves us outside of ourselves to contemplate something else. She would argue that that movement from curved in on self to looking outward at another is fundamental to becoming more just people, to seeing that we aren't the center of the world, to moving towards virtue. C.S. Lewis had a pretty similar observation. He writes that the primary impulse of each is to maintain and aggrandize himself. The secondary impulse is to go out of the self, to correct its provincialism and heal its loneliness. In love, in virtue, in the pursuit of knowledge, and here's so important, and in the reception of the arts, we are doing this. And in this, he's making a case in the larger work. It's a work of criticism by him. It's talking about the place and the importance of fiction. Now, one quick criticism that you might have is, well, isn't that really just like escapism? Does that really translate into our lives? Is this just something that we're going to indulge in so much that we no longer actually bring back to the real world? But I think this is a case simply of arguing from the idea of too much of a good thing, right? On the one hand, fiction could be escapism, is if you only ever read it and it never impacted your life. But I don't think either of those things happen all that much. I think to say that it's possible that you could read so much that you never engage in your real life, sure, that's true, but that's a bit like saying you could eat so much broccoli that, you wouldn't have a well-balanced diet. It doesn't make broccoli bad for you. It just means that you're perverting its good use. In the same way with fiction, if it's all you ever did was read and you never engaged in your real life, well, of course that would be bad. But that's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that it's part of a good life. It's part of a well-rounded intellectual life. It's part of a well-rounded moral virtue, like just a well-rounded engagement with your everyday life. And so for that reason, I don't think that argument quite hits home. And I think the point stands that fiction, by allowing us to engage in the lives of others, right, more so than nonfiction could, more so than other works, because we're entering into these stories fully and we're moving into new worlds. It's taking us out away from ourselves. It's allowing us to see differently and to no longer be the center of the world, but we allow others to quite literally take center stage. Which brings me to my second point, that reading fiction is a practice of seeing from other perspectives. So this is really important. Now, I'm just going to kind of take it as an agreed point that we think seeing from a multiplicity of perspectives is good, or maybe we could even say that having many wise counselors is good. And I think fiction gives us that. It gives us so many sage voices that we never have to meet face to face. And until recently, we couldn't engage with people from all over the world. You might just engage with people in your town, and still we're limited with the number of people we're going to interact with. But in fiction, we get to see from the perspectives of so many, hear from the perspectives of so many. Now, in nonfiction, too, we hear the thoughts of others, which is good. And I would suggest reading nonfiction and reading widely from multiple perspectives, which is one of the reasons why I love so much what we do on this channel, right? Where we hear from the voices of church history, right? Where we engage with the fathers. It deepens our study and it helps us to have a more well-rounded perspective. And we notice our blind spots as they ask questions that we wouldn't even think to ask. But fiction takes this a step further, because we're not just hearing the thoughts of others, but we're feeling their feelings, or we're engaging in a full-bodied way, even though it's only in our imagination, right? But we're taking their steps. Imagine if Tolkien had wanted to write a treatise on friendship. I'm sure it would have been great. But would you have felt what Sam and Frodo felt? If J.K. Rowling wanted to write something on whimsy, I'm sure she could have done a wonderful job on it. But would it have ever been the same as that first time you step into Weasley's wizard wheezes? Of course not, right? In the same way Shakespeare could talk about fate in an abstract sense, or he could give us star-crossed lovers. Homer could talk about virtue, or you could see people dying on the battlefield, or you could you could talk about longing for home, or you could have Odysseus. I think we can agree that by entering into their full experience, in fact, often seeing, in the perspective of the novel, right? Seeing through their eyes, we inhabit their perspective in such a deeper way. And it's often been said that the person who reads 1,000 books lives 1,000 lives. And as maybe trite and cliche as that is, I think there's a lot of truth. That in reading, we get to embody the lives of others, which we can then bring back to our own life to hopefully see in a more nuanced way that helps us live with more of a sense of virtue, and we get to see the virtue of these characters and hopefully maybe emulate it in our own life. And the last and final point that I'd like to make quickly is that reading fiction can just be a celebration of the goodness of human talent. So often I think we can make this wrongly attempted pious move of kind of rejecting all things in the world and rejecting beauty as though it's something we don't need. But beauty actually points us back to God. And I think that good fiction at its best points us towards the goodness of God. We get to celebrate the fact that God made a beautiful earth, filled it with brilliant creatures who then use their God-given talents to reflect back something of the goodness of that creation. And I think if we enjoy it in the right mode, as not just an end to itself, but as a vehicle to looking beyond it, we can actually allow fiction and art generally to be something that allows us to celebrate the goodness of God and the wonder of his creation, including the brilliant creatures that he's created in us. And so I hope that maybe that gives you some freedom to go back to your love of fiction. I hope that you can see that fiction is not just a trivial pleasure, but can actually be something that helps us grow as people. Now, I said I might give a couple book recommendations. I'm going to give at least two. One is the most recent favorite fiction book I've read, and one might be my favorite fiction, just writ large. And so the most recent would be Loris. It's a Russian novel that was recently translated into English, and it's just fantastic. It is out of kind of the Middle Ages, not when it was written, but that's kind of the setting of it. And we have this Russian holy man who's a traveling healer, and he goes on this wonderful journey, and it's very much in the vein of Way of a Pilgrim, and I think it's going to take you on an adventure that is explicitly connected to the Christian tradition, and you get to think about what it means to be holy, but also in a fictional way that I think is really great. But if we want to go beyond Christian fiction, because I don't think it's just Christian fiction, and C.S. Lewis would have problems with that, right? Fiction doesn't have religious belief. But if we want to go beyond fictional books about religious characters. One of my favorite books of all time is Independent People by Haldor Laxness. You've probably not heard of it. Maybe you have. Icelandic author, won the Nobel Prize for fiction. But it's a fascinating book about what it means to be independent. And so often in my life, I used to think that independence was kind of the highest good. I remember when I took Thoreau as a real hero. And then later, I remember reading Into the Wild about Christopher McCandless and realizing that maybe there's a darker side to it. And then in Independent People, I think you get to really see that maybe what we want ultimately isn't being independent, but maybe what we truly need is one another. But again, by doing this in fiction, it's just so much deeper and so much more beautiful. Anyway, the fiction we read, though, it doesn't have to be that heady. It can just be simply for enjoyment. Last year, I read the whole Harry Potter series. Not mad about it. It was great. In fact, I think I learned a lot from it. Anyway, I'd love to know what you all are reading. What are some of your favorite fictional books? And I hope to hear some of your perspectives on how fiction can help us in our walk with Jesus and just our journey as people. Anyway, this is Gospel Simplicity, a channel where we're passionate about beautiful simplicity and transformative power of the gospel, where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological and historical complexity, or sometimes we just have a good chat. So if you're into that kind of thing, I encourage you to hit subscribe. If you want to become a part of a community that reads text together, you can go on patreon.com/gospelsimplicity, and you can join our reading club. Anyway, until next time, thanks and God bless.